Hey, everybody, welcome back to the Preacher Boys podcast. Today, I am sitting down with Marissa, Burt, and Kelsey, Kramer, McGinnis. They're the authors of the forthcoming book, The Myth of Good Christian Parenting, which hits shelves on October 14th, 2025. You can actually pick up a copy by clicking a link in the show notes of this episode and putting in a pre-order right now. And every purchase made through that link actually helps support this show as well. So be sure to go ahead and check that out and pre-order your copy right now. But this raises some really good conversation around some of the toxic teaching that parents have had regarding how to raise children in evangelical circles. It also covers things like the rights of children, the effects of corporal punishment when it's carried out within a home. And it's just a really fantastic book that really analyzes these topics. And there was so much that came into this conversation. It's no exaggeration to say we could have talked for literally like 3 or 4 hours, especially with all the things that have happened since the advanced reader copies have gone out for the book. We've had the passing of John MacArthur. We've had the passing just the day before we did the interview of James Dobson. And so sitting down for the conversation, we tried to capture the current moment quite a bit. We tried to talk about the outpouring of feelings that people have about the passing of James Dobson, the rage that people who are harmed by his teaching are just expressing right now on social media. And there's just a lot of other things. I look at the one of the runner-ups from a past season of The Bachelor, Madison Pruitt, now has a Christian podcast with her husband, Grant Trout, where they just, again, were featured in a lot of websites and magazines for gleefully talking about how hilarious it'll be when they get to enact corporal punishment on their daughter. We reacted to clips from the past of Jack Hyles, who's mentioned in the book as well. This episode, I think, is going to bring up a lot of tough conversations, but I think necessary ones for people who are looking for healing, for people who are looking to parent better, or for experts trying to get a better grasp on the harm that's done within these systems. So definitely listen to the entire conversation. I think you're going to enjoy every single second of it. There's something in this for everybody. But I'm going to stop talking for now and get us directly into our conversation with Marissa, Burt, and Kelsey, Kramer, McGinnis. Enjoy the episode. All right, everybody, welcome back to the show. Today I have 2 guests with me, Marissa and Kelsey. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, already in sync. I love it.
We are more in sync than you know. I bought a couch last week and I posted a picture on the internet and Marissa texted me. I was like, Kelsey, we have the same couch.
I have that couch.
That's what happens when you write a book together.
That is how in sync we are.
Well,
I love it.
Let me ask that first. Do you feel like the book has put you guys in sync, or do you think the book is a product of 2 people having a lot of conversations and going, this should be a book?
I mean, the idea for the book brought us together. We didn't know each other before. So, I mean, in a lot of ways, it really was this idea that I think we'd both been thinking about in different ways for a while, and then just happened to meet on the internet. The internet is a terrible place in many ways, but in this way, it was wonderful.
Yeah, it was such a bright spot. And so I think, we worked together for 2 years now, brainstorming, researching, sharing ideas, drafting, revising. So then I think you kind of, we come together with one voice in a lot of ways. But it was wonderful to work together.
Yeah. Well, that's good to hear. That would make for a really awkward interview if that wasn't the case. You're like, we hate each other now. 2 years. It's been miserable. We're here to talk about, obviously, your book, Myth of Good Christian Parenting, which is a title that everybody's like, let me add that to my cart right now, because it evokes a lot of feelings about a lot of different things. But something happened yesterday I have to bring up, and I'd be a horrible host if I didn't. Since you guys, this book is not out yet. This is an advanced copy. And since this book has been out as an advanced copy, John MacArthur and James Dobson have both passed away. One, does that have you guys scrambling to do any last minute things to the book? Is it too late for that? And then also, like, what's your take on the reaction to those things? Because there's a lot of feelings being shared right now that I think tie in so much with the topic of the book. So, Marissa, if you want to kind of start with your take, and then Kelsey, you can kind of give yours as well.
Wow. It is a little bit surreal to hop on social media and see the things we've been kind of in the weeds with for 2 years be trending and just boom, 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 like the people, the events, some of the connections. I think we knew as we've been sharing throughout this whole process on social media, we knew there would be resonance. Like we heard that in the interviews and surveys we conducted. We heard the ways this was touching with some tender places, pain points for people, things people were thinking through and deconstructing. But when those both of those deaths happened, I mean, I think the collective conversation really highlights a number of things we explore in our book, as well as I've been thinking a lot this week, particularly with the news about Dobson, because my feed is full of both people kind of lauding him and his ministry and people celebrating his death and expressing the pain that they feel he directly or indirectly caused. And generally speaking, there's a generational gap there. I mean, not wholly, but you do see that. And that is a significant thing we came up against again and again, this sense of disconnection, this sense of estrangement, this differing experience between generations and the way they received these ideas, the way they talk about them now. And so, yeah, it feels very timely. When we started working, we thought this is a long overdue conversation. Like we kind of couldn't believe that this topic hadn't been broached yet in book form. And I think that really speaks to that. Like this is a really timely conversation where a lot of families whose stories touch evangelicalism are experiencing this and processing this. What would you say, Kelsey?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean the two deaths of John MacArthur and James Dobson are a little bit jarring. Both of them make appearances in our book. Both of them have written about parenting, about concerns about the state of the American family for years. John MacArthur had a book come out, I think 2 years ago, or maybe 1 year ago, a very alarmist book about the state of the American family and children. And so it has been interesting to see the reaction, not surprising, the reaction. Depending on which side of the internet you're on, you get very different sides. I write for Christianity Today, which means I get a really interesting look at the process of the people who write obituaries for us have to walk that line really carefully. It is, man, it's a hard job. And CT is sort of a old guard evangelical publication. And so I think that, I'm not the person writing those obituaries, but it's interesting to see how people try to negotiate and walk that line between acknowledging the harm that both of these men have caused and the people who they've enabled over the years, the bad advice they've given. At the same time, I find myself a little bit grieved by the eagerness to kind of point out singular villains, because one thing we really tried to do in our book is not just zoom in on James Dobson or zoom in on one person. When we talk about Christian parenting teaching, Dobson is probably the name that looms largest, but really, like, especially when we're talking about millennial and Gen Z parents, they're not buying his books. His ideas are being recycled, but he's not this like singular villain that now that he's gone, there's going to be this changing of the guard of ideas. And so absolutely, like I like, seeing people who have experienced harm feel like they can speak out about it and find others who can affirm that pain. At the same time, I want us to be watching, because I think there's some parallels between this political moment and the political moment that James Dobson was responding to in the 1970s that could very easily enable someone like that again.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Kelsey, you bring up a good point, and it's something that I had a conversation with somebody when MacArthur passed, and I was on a podcast, and they were asking about it. And I'm a very, I don't know, I don't know what the word is for it, but I'm not the dance on the grave person, like just in general, like I it's just not my personality. Like, but I think some of it is not just because like, oh, I'm a really good person, I'm better than everybody. Because I think there's all the reactions are appropriate to the thing that they've experienced. So I want to be clear with that. For me, I think more of it, honestly, as I sat with why I felt that way about MacArthur is for the reason you just said, which is like, okay, everyone's got the ding dong, the witch is dead approach to this, but the belief system is still there. It's already taken many different forms. And my biggest fear, I don't know if you two have seen this. Obviously, it's too soon with Dobson to see how it's going to play out. But like historically, when a figure passes away, it lionizes them in a way that they never were before. And it's like, I'm sure Grace to You sold a lot of MacArthur books in the week that he passed. So like for me, it's almost like they might be more powerful now. It might be more insidious now. There's not that one figure to point to. Um, does that, am I off base there? Do you feel that as well? Like, how do you think that manifests itself typically?
Yeah. I mean, one thing that does worry me is that we are seeing a resurgence in interest in more authoritarian parenting methods right now. We're seeing people speak more publicly about corporal punishment and the need for discipline. And my fear is that the kind of celebration over Dobson's death is going to polarize people even more. And the folks who are already primed to look say, hey, actually, this gentle parenting of the past 10 years is creating so many problems. Maybe this Dobson guy had something good to offer. And people turn around and go, look for Dare to Discipline or The Strong-Willed Child or those kinds of books. I don't know. But the appetite is there. It's something we've been watching and been saying, I think we're about to see a resurgence of this for about a year now. And I think that so far has been the case.
Yeah. I think so too. I mean, you see FAFO parenting
right.
making headlines, right? Kind of tongue in cheek, like we just need to get tough and stop coddling and things like that. And the pendulum kind of chronically swings back and forth with parenting trends. But in Christian parenting circles, I think it's worth noting that I don't know if it ever really swung toward gentle parenting. I mean, obedience and corporal punishment are key ingredients across resources. And like you noted, these do circulate because many of these people built what we call Christian parenting empires. Yeah. So it ties into broader collective and community beliefs, particularly because many of them built their brand with family life teaching, right? We do mark Dobson as the beginning of this development of an explicitly Christian parenting market. And he really paved the way for that. And Doug Wilson, Gary Ezzo, you can kind of tick a bunch of different names where people do this. They produce a lot of parenting or family life resources. It draws in a lot of families. They kind of create international ministries based on that. So absolutely, the ideas live on and are recycled in a number of ways.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things that my wife actually, she's always like my uncredited research assistant because she's like finds things. She's like, you're talking about this, mention this. And she sent me a clip. I don't know if you guys have seen, you had to have, but Maddie Pruitt, who was in Connect to the Bachelor. So you've already seen the clip. I was going to pull it up and share screen it if you haven't, so we could talk about it. I'll just insert it in the episode.
Like if Hosanna obeys us, we're not like, come here, girl, come here. All right, pull him down. Get the, mama, get her. Which will be hilarious when we start spanking Hosanna, which
Lord.
We will go on the record because the Bible so clearly says
clear about that.
It says folly is bound up in a child, but discipline drives it far away.
Well, and it also specifically talks about discipline with the rod.
With the rod. It says it will not kill them.
Because some people could say, well, you can discipline them with timeouts. Hold on. It says with the rod.
She gonna get a little bit. It's not gonna be, yeah.
And it's not, and it's gonna be in a very loving way of saying, hi, sweetheart, do you know why you're being disciplined? Mommy does not want to discipline you. Mommy does not enjoy having to spank you, but there are consequences to disobedience.
100%.
And that's what you're saying is there are consequences to our sin. There are consequences to disobedience.
She showed me that clip. And what's interesting from my background growing up in a fundamentalist Baptist realm, I have to remind myself that that's shocking. Like that's not just how parents talk, And but the amount of people who are shocked, the amount of publications that picked it up shows that this isn't a generally culturally acceptable way of thinking, but it is for a large swath of evangelicals, the norm. So I guess in your perspective, writing a book on topics like this, addressing people talking the way that they were in that clip, like, was your goal to shake primarily evangelicals who do believe this out of it? Or was your goal more primarily to point out to the majority of culture, like, hey, some of your neighbors think this, and hey, some of your teachers and that Christian counselor down the road is actually affirming this? Like, who is the ideal demographic there that you were approaching?
We wanted to keep it accessible and broad. So our primary audience of readers that we were hoping to reach are people who this touches up against their experience. So either parents reflecting back or adult children reflecting back. We knew there would be a number of current active parents in evangelical communities or coming out of evangelical communities thinking, well, coming to that realization, maybe what was normal for me, maybe there's a different way forward. Maybe I don't want to replicate that. But we also wanted it to be of interest to maybe pastors, therapists, spiritual directors, other professionals who may not be as familiar with the specifics of evangelical frameworks. Because if you go to a therapist who has no idea about this background or the way this is wrapped up with religious trauma or religious belief, it's a really important context, I think, for people outside the community who are maybe trying to understand something about people they're either working with or the subculture in general, that you're right, isn't intuitive and really is divergent from where mainstream parenting trends went starting around the 70s and 80s. It kind of went in a different direction. So yeah, maybe all.
You wanted everybody in the country to buy your book. That seems like a good wide net. Yeah, I am curious, like, so when you see someone like a Maddie Pruitt and a Grant sitting on a podcast and this kind of cheerful, like, it almost feels like, for lack of a better colloquial, like kind of boomer coded, like the stuff that I would hear older pastors say within churches growing up that always scared you as a kid because you're like, oh God, this is going to rev everyone up. Like when you hear younger influencers with cool hair and nice clothes talking about it and a sick sneaker collection behind it, like why do you think that generation is getting sucked into that vortex? Like, what do you think the draw is? Because like, for the most part, it seems like the generations who experienced it either really want to follow that same path or run as far as possible from it. But there's an infatuation with like Gen Z to like this old school lifestyle when it comes to masculinity, femininity, trad wife, parenting. What do you think the draw and appeal of that is? Is it just ignorance or what? What's that coming from?
I mean, I think some of it is that just chronic pendulum swinging that generations tend to do as they look at the one before them and say, look at all the things that they did wrong. Look at their kids. Look how annoying the iPad kids are, right? Like, I think there's this like weird kind of discourse building that people do when they look up at the generation above them. There's been a lot of theorizing about why Gen Z is drawn to, broadly the cultural things and media that they are. And I think it's hard to say. I do think that within evangelical communities, Gen Z evangelicals have been sold some of the same ideas that millennials and Gen X were about being countercultural as just being a value in and of its own. And being countercultural means doing what the world is telling you not to do. So if the world is saying, you don't need to spank your children, you can connect with your children instead. And someone in your community is saying, no, that's permissive, that's giving sin a pass. That's a really winsome message for young people who are growing up in evangelicalism with some fundamentalist flavors that are really drawn to this idea of being countercultural. I think that that's a piece of this that is underexplored, is just this idea that like the way everybody else around you is going to tell you to raise your kids is wrong. You can't trust yourself. And here is a formula for you. And that's not new either. That's like an old message that Dobson would have agreed with, right? Don't trust yourself. You as a parent you're going to tend to be so permissive. You're going to tend to let your children walk all over you. Don't do that. Be the countercultural, be daring, right? Dare to be the parent that disciplines your child. So I think there are a lot of things in that message that still resonate with evangelicals who are told that they have this kind of countercultural combative mission in the world that we live in.
Yeah, and I would add to that, there's a really compelling piece of claims to biblical authority. So if someone's devout and they respect the Bible in some fashion as authoritative, or that's the environment they're coming from, that gets wielded a lot. And you will find in a number of these resources, the authors will open up in some way saying, this isn't my opinion. This is just the plain truth of the Word of God. And it goes relatively unquestioned. We do challenge that in our book, because just because someone claims something is biblical doesn't necessarily make it so. But that's a very powerful thing in Christian communities. And so I think I actually stitched a number of responses to Maddie and Grant when that came out, because it is concerning to see the same old things crop up with a shinier package. And I think we can maybe have two takeaways, probably more from that. One is it might give us some empathy for earlier generations of parents, in that it's easy to stand at a distance and be like, how could they fall for it? How could someone read Dobson's book and find it compelling? Rather than say, yes, these ideas will always be attractive, particularly to new parents and new converts. I think new parents are often overwhelmed and looking for that reassurance, especially if they're in communities that say, look for an authority figure to tell you how to do this in the godly way. And then I think new converts are vulnerable to this because they want to do things the Christian way, or to not do things the way they were raised. And so I think it can give us that, and it can also help us maybe see that often the people writing these books or speaking so confidently are parents of very young children. And it's not that there's nothing worthwhile that you can say when you just have young children, but there is a level of assuredness about theoretical parenting advice that people platform themselves to share that comes in those early years, whether it's, how am I going to parent? I will never let my child watch screens, or I will never let them, it can be things like that, or whether spanking is the way. And so I think with people like Maddie and Grant, I would hope that they begin to deconstruct. I mean, we hear from a number of people who becoming a parent was the catalyst that led them to reconsider. And maybe before they would have held those same beliefs very staunchly, but as they began to see the child in front of them and reflect back on their own experience, they were hungry to find a different way forward. And that kind of was the gateway out of that thinking for them. So I hold out hope for them.
You've said three things, and I wrote down all of them because they're all things that we could follow as branches. So I'm going to try to somehow navigate into all of these.
Sounds great.
The one thing that I want to hit off the rip is you are both people of faith. There is a theological component to the book. I am really interested. Fundamentalism is so easy in terms of it is so easy to say the Bible says this, boom, that's it.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't matter if your interpretation, that's what it says. I read it and that's what I think it means. And that's it. It's interesting to me, same thing when I have conversation with Beth Allison Barr, where she has a really interesting, compelling argument for why this passage is extremely radically feminist in the context in which it was written. But then there's also some things that really aren't, and they're very regressive. I'm curious when it came to approaching corporal punishment. I feel like there's two slopes to the argument where, okay, does the Bible expressly call for corporal punishment of kids? I think you guys argue in many ways, no. The way the rod is even described is incorrect. But there are very clear passages in, say, Deuteronomy, where capital punishment for a progressively rebellious child is called into play. So I guess what's your approach to what you're grabbing onto as biblical or the Christian perspective versus okay, that is a relic of its time in its historical context, and it doesn't represent big G God. And I guess I'm curious what the approach was to those things. And Marissa, you can answer that first if you'd like.
This is such a great question. Because if you dip into any Christian parenting community or online forum, you will find this back and forth over corporal punishment, right? You will find staunch defenders. You will find people getting down into the minutia of what the rod could mean.
Yeah.
And that, I think, really reflects the commitments people have, devout people have. They want to honor Scripture. They want to find a godly way to do things. It really speaks to those longings, which is why we like the language of myth a lot, because it refers to the way these books appeal to various longings. So, I mean, I could write a whole book making the Christian case against corporal punishment, but I think my general response is to invite Christians to consider that Jesus is always our hermeneutic. When in the Christian faith, we believe that when God decided to reveal to humanity what he was like in human form, he became incarnate. And the life and ministry and teaching of Jesus is going to be the guide to see what are things in alignment with that. And second to that, to say do we get any explicit teaching as Christian parents? Because I think a big piece of where the corporal punishment conversation goes off the rails is because of the influence of what's called the nouthetic movement, the biblical counseling movement that says the Bible is this instruction manual for life. And so you can find everything you need there, kind of almost like a user guide. Mm-hmm. And that is a little bit at odds with the fact that most of the Bible comes to us in narrative form. It's telling us this story of the people of God over millennia. And so as Christians, if we are saying, are there any direct instructions that we should be attentive to? There are two direct instructions given to parents in Scripture. And that's fathers, parents, do not provoke your children to anger or embitter them. And in Ephesians 6, it is followed up, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. And so I think having those two things as the key guide for Christian parents enables you to then look at these other passages to say, okay, we know that not embittering or provoking is key. We know that the one anothering verses apply to our smallest and newest neighbors. We see the life and teaching of Jesus. These are helpful for people who want to have some kind of biblical conversation. These are really helpful and expansive. There's a tremendous amount of freedom for the Christian parent within there. The Bible's not a parenting manual in that sense. And so it's curious to me that in all the resources we read, we rarely heard the name of Jesus mentioned in a meaningful way. We rarely saw his life and ministry discussed. We saw again and again this handful of Proverbs, the rod Proverbs, and Hebrews 12, again and again and again discussed. And as we argue, and I think is true in irresponsibly exegetical and hermeneutical ways, like in ways that don't hold up. But they become things people cling to. And I think it's the biggest roadblock for Christians to give up corporal punishment. They really have been misled to believe that these rituals of spanking toddlers and preschoolers are somehow biblical. And so I will talk about it all day long, because I think it's something that Christian parents need to hear from other Christians, to say, you can be free of that. We can be done with that. None of this is theoretical anymore. We have a number of adults describing the incredible long-term harm and impact it had. Yeah. We have good research in the past 50 years showing the harm. We have robust exegetical arguments to say, look, this doesn't track. So it's a difficult topic to talk about and engage sometimes, but really important, because I think families need to be freed up from it.
Yeah. Well, there was a quote somewhere. I was trying to find it as you were sharing the answer. There was a quote from a evangelical leader that was basically talking about discipline and helping shape your children to be more like Jesus, almost implying that corporal punishment and, ritualistic spanking, as you guys quoted Jack Hyles saying, was what made Jesus Jesus. It's like that was not the chemistry experiment that led to that. And it seems like an odd way to invent a new formula to try to get the same result. And Kelsey, I'm curious what your take is on this as well. Like when people are cherry picking or looking at, two verses to paint an entire, like, the fact that the Bible says so little on this topic, and yet there are empires of parenting material, says that there's a lot being inserted that's not from the source. Like when your piece on the source is bigger than the source, you're adding something else. So I'm curious what your take on that is.
Yeah, I mean, I would say two things. One, I mean, first of all, preface this by saying I'm not a biblical scholar or a theologian here, so this is sort of my take with those caveats. But I will say, in the interviewing that we did for this, you can see the inconsistency and in the ways that people apply and interpret and try to make sense of why they must spank their children. Like, you'll hear people say things like, well, it's the best way because it's how God deals with us, one and done. You know, like, there's like trying to draw some strange parallels as if to say, like, and that when you dig under that for more than 5 seconds, it falls apart almost immediately. You'll have parents who say, well, it's not about punishing my child for that sin. Jesus already died for that sin. It's about fixing the behavior, right? Like taking a real behaviorist approach, which has its all kinds of issues. Like, behaviorism is a very utilitarian approach to treating people and doing relationship that I do not think is in line with the example of Christ at all. And the other thing I would say is that I often encourage people to try to take more of an ethics-based approach to this question, one that doesn't treat the Bible like it's going to give you that answer, because these scriptures are either vague about this or not clearly meant to be this, timeless piece of wisdom handed to all people for all time. Let's just treat this like an ethical question. Is it ethical to hit children? And I think a lot of evangelicals are uncomfortable with that because that feels like letting like a man-made system of rules supersede the Bible.
Yeah.
But I think in this case, it is very instructive, because imagine you are caring for an elderly relative and they don't understand you, or they're struggling, their cognitive ability is starting to decline. Can you hit that person to make them stop doing something or to try to teach them to stop? Everyone would say no. Like, everyone, I can't imagine one person that we spoke to saying that it's okay for husbands to beat their wives. There are ethical ways of dealing with questions of inflicting pain on another human being. And when the answer yes is informed entirely by a utilitarian framework, I think we can start to say, well, that's not how Jesus deals with people. And so there are parts in the book where we talk about that, about taking an ethical view and taking a step back from trying to twist yourself into knots over reading these verses the right way to justify this practice.
Right. Well, it's when you're teaching that formula of like, if you do X, Y, and Z, your kid will become this. You're essentially making the kid a product. It's like, if you want your product to perform correctly, do this. And one of my favorite quotes from the book, I don't know which of you wrote it, so sorry if whichever one it wasn't. But on page 49, it says, evangelicals are often the first and loudest to claim that children are a blessing, yet this messaging places children at the bottom of a set hierarchy defined by obedience, submission, and relationship to a parent. In that framing, children are afterthoughts in the garden and accessories, arrows to fulfill a father's aims, olive shoots around a mother's table, non-player background characters who exist to rise up and bless their parents. And it's one of the things, like, to me, this sums up the rest of the book in terms of, are you having children because you want the beauty of being a part of another human being's life, which you literally have a whole section on whether or not kids are human, or do you want them because they make you look like the ideal Christian version? Like, I just chatted with Amy Duggar, so this is fresh on my mind.
Oh, yes.
Like, you look at someone like that where it's like, do you have a deep, close relationship with all 19 children in your quiverful family? Or do you look like an idealized version of the family that has lots of arrows in your quiver? Like, that to me is such a disturbing element of this, is like, why do you have the child in the first place? And I don't think most people have a great answer for that. Not a question, but more of a concern I'll just voice out loud.
Yeah, well, and it really sums up the kind of betrayal. Like, when we say these teachings betrayed entire families, it really robbed so many families of connection that could have been theirs.
Mm.
And certainly, yes, some abusive people were drawn to these teachings. I think a number of people got ensnared in them
Yeah.
and believed they had to do this, or this is the godly way, or it worked when children were young, or they were thinking it's all wrapped up in different belief systems, so broader ideas about hierarchies and fundamentalism. But down the road, it really not only inflicted harm, but left families bereft of tools for connection, of the joy of those moments that could have been theirs, because it
Yeah.
was about, yes, securing certain ends, or it was utilitarian, or it was about behavior. And it's really a heartbreaking kind of realization to uncover as we talked to so many people, because so many are still picking up the pieces from this in a number of ways, and often in shame and isolation, because especially if they're still in Christian communities, because this idea of lack of family closeness is also a sign of your failure. And so it's a very painful topic for a number of people, and I think for the church collectively, for Christians collectively, it's important for us to acknowledge the ways our communities enabled this, our teaching enabled this, and in some ways directly caused this.
Right.
Mhm.
Well, it's
Mhm.
it's setting aside intentionally abusive people who found a framework to be abusive in. Like, there's a lot of people who were, I'd say, accidentally abusive or taught to be abusive with some of this stuff. And earlier, one of you mentioned, having kids as a catalyst for a lot of deconstruction, people that realize the system's harmful. But also having kids has been a catalyst historically for many to find religion or put their kids in church because they want the structure and the law and order. And it's it's unfortunate because I think you don't know what you don't know. You just know what you don't want to happen. And when someone comes and offers the answer, like,
Mhm.
it seems very appealing. I am curious to hear from you, Kelsey, on this point. We've talked about like the countercultural, like fundamentalists are historically reactionary to the culture's going this way, we're going to go this way. But if you scale this back to like the 1950s or the 1960s, you see in the culture at large this like corporal punishment. Do you think the culture birthed the modern Christian parenting movement? Or do you think the Christian parenting movement and how entrenched Christianity was in the culture kind of birthed that into the culture at large? Like, chicken or the egg, like, where did this come from if we trace it back far enough? Pre-Dobson, pre-MacArthur, like, how do you explain the 1950s sitcom that is espousing weird Christian parenting views?
Yeah, like, I think it's worth saying that spanking and corporal punishment have been the norm for most of Western history. Like,
Yeah.
when James Dobson writes in 1970 that culture has gone wrong and no one is disciplining their kids, what he has in mind is something very specific, which is probably the best-selling parenting book to that point, which was Dr. Spock's book, Benjamin Spock's. I think it's called Baby and Child Care. Um, and his adage was, trust yourself, you know more than you think you do. And he was this voice of trying to uh, help anxious mothers feel like they had some form of maternal instinct. When you read interviews with Benjamin Spock, he talks a lot about in his practice dealing with moms who just felt like they had no idea what to do. They felt like they had no sense of natural maternal instinct and were totally at a loss for what to do with these children when they're home all day with children. This is the 50s and 60s. This is the post-war boom. There is so much success in certain segments of the white American family. You have kind of affluence. You also have then in the 60s the rise of feminism and Betty Friedan and the feminine mystique and this kind of female disillusionment with what am I doing here? And James Dobson is very much reacting to the 60s. He's reacting to looking backwards and saying, okay, we've had this affluence, we've had this emergence of this kind of touchy-feely parenting advice, and these affluent white parents who are suddenly not adequately disciplining their children. And those are the people responsible for the anti-Vietnam War protests. Those are the people responsible for bra burning. Those are the people responsible for Woodstock. And
all the worst things in history.
All the
biggest
worst things.
Problems in history. Bra burnings and Woodstock and anti-Vietnam.
That's right. You know? That's right. And I mean, Dare to Discipline, he wrote that book in 6 months. It was very much a book for this exact moment, for this exact group of parents who are showing up to my seminars anxious and really responding well to this message that I have of we need more discipline. Because leading up to the publication of Dare to Discipline, he's been on the speaking circuit, kind of trying out different messages. He wants to be on the speaking circuit. He wants to become kind of a public thinker. And he finds that this message, you should discipline your kids, is really landing with the audiences. And he says, okay, there's an appetite for this. And that book absolutely met the moment. It also happened to coincide with conservative resurgence politically, and it was kind of a what's that saying? High tide raises all ships, or something. It was kind of one of those moments where I think that resurgence led to the ascent of a couple different figures. I think kind of similarly to what we're seeing now in some ways.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's how I would answer that. It's an interesting cultural moment, but Dobson really recognized how things were shifting around him and was able to capitalize on that. He was quite savvy that way.
Yeah, I'm seeing that right now with young men, like the surge we're seeing of Gen Z men getting involved in church at a higher rate than previous generations, and than Gen Z women right now who are leaving for some unknown reason in mass volumes. I'm seeing that happen, and there's a weird symbiosis between the most extreme far right figures and the church, where it's like I recently typed out a tweet from Andrew Tate, who's a very crazy example of this, and then a fundamentalist pastor I grew up listening to, and they said exactly the same thing, give or take one or two lines. It was the same methodology, same purity culture language, but just being one's being shot out into the manosphere to the men facing the quote unquote male loneliness epidemic, and then you've got the other side that's speaking to this intense purity culture, but they're sharing the same thing and they're strong together, and the high tide is definitely raising all ships in that case. I am really curious. You mentioned Spock's book, and you quote Jack Hyles, which I always love to see an IFB guy get thrown in these books. Mm-hmm. Have you seen Jack Hyles talk about Spock's book? Have you seen that clip?
No, I haven't.
Oh, not the clip.
Okay.
Now, it just may be, for example, that Mr. Spock's book may be good. I use Mr. Spock's book in the rearing of our kids. I did. It makes a good paddle. I used it to spank the kids with. And now it just may be that be okay. But we don't know that's okay, but we...
That was his take on it. Very
There's
rich.
Always the humor. There's always the humor.
Always the humor, yeah.
You will always see when Christian pastors or leaders or adults who are in talking about this together. And I think it's really revealing the way that collectively we deal with the discomfort of this, or maybe delight in the power it gives to joke about hitting children.
Yeah. I remember we had a guest speaker that would come through and he would say, I'm not saying it's okay, but my dad would throw me through walls and this, or timeout is how long you're unconscious. You'd hear those kinds of phrases. And I think it's interesting looking back and going, well, they're definitely coping with what they experienced growing up, but are not breaking that cycle and are continuing it onward.
There's so much generational trauma, I think, to this.
Yeah. What do you think is the point of that crossroads where there's some that are raised in this, and you're seeing it with the Dobson death. People were raised in it and go, this is why I am who I am today. I was raised in this system, and this gave me the tools to be a functioning adult in a society gone mad. And then you have the other people that are going, thank God he's dead. And this was horrible and this was horrific. And I experienced this. And it's the reason that I am anxious and I do feel this way. Like, why do you think there's that experience where two people can go through the same horrific system and some credit it for them being like, I turned out okay. And then other people recognize the harm it did and are breaking the cycle. Like, why doesn't everyone have the same response to it?
I mean, a number of things. We always will offer the disclaimer, the ways individual families experience this is going to vary as much as an individual family, or even within the same family. Siblings could have had a different experience. So certainly temperament, family culture play into this. The ways families implemented things, they maybe mitigated it, they maybe exacerbated it. However, I think it's worth noting, we'll see as more time comes out. I actually haven't seen a lot of people who were children in Dobson homes saying, take credit how I turned out. I hear some people reflecting with fondness on hearing him on the radio or Adventures in Odyssey,
Right.
which for
I guess
me
that's
kind
fair.
of clues me into like, okay, so maybe people had dipped into this in some way, or maybe a parent read one book and kind of was able to pick and choose from that. I think for the people who went all in, it seems roundly unhelpful, and more in the sense that they maybe thrived in spite of this teaching rather than because of it. And the people I hear kind of lauding Dobson are doing it either for his broad views or from the perspective of a parent, which I think is curious. I think that's revealing not that there's nothing of good in these resources. We try to be careful to say, some parents found helpful things in a number of these resources, with a few exceptions. There are a few that we're willing to say this should just have been straight in the trash. So I think that's worth noting, particularly because you can read the resources themselves, and some of them are recipes for estrangement, inauthentic connection, anxiety. I mean, all the kinds of things we're talking about, let alone these things happening behind closed doors and the toxic combination of expectations for instant obedience and corporal punishment being your only tool. You are going to have escalation.
Yeah.
One other thought that I think is interesting, I was talking with the host of Christianity on the Spectrum podcast recently, and he has done a kind of wide survey sample of neurodivergent autistic Christians. And he was making the observation that given the genetic component of neurodivergence, of kind of raising the question, were some people, the people who were all in on these things, did they perhaps have this desire for very black and white, rigid thinking and application that kind of kept them from walking away from it, or kept them from being the kind of parent who was like, I flipped through Dobson's book and did some things, did other
It's a
things.
grab bag of different things. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think there are other things to explore of what drew certain people to these in a way that they were all in or above and beyond even what Dobson would have recommended. Because and I want to hear your response on this, Kelsey, but one other thing I wanted to mention on the spanking question was we do see something really different happening with the rise of Dobson than the kind of beating of children into compliance that maybe would have happened before this, right? Many cultures, not all, but many cultures would have beat children, in that we see these kind of step-by-step rituals for calm, detached spanking as being presented as good and godly. And that's something very different than I think maybe you see before. You can see it even in early American cartoons where an angry adult grabs a child and puts them over their knees. So with Dobson introduced this idea that there's a specifically godly way to do this that demarcates it from hitting your child because you're angry at them. And he presented that to parents, and all the Christian parenting experts after him replicated that.
Yeah.
And said, here are the specific rules that will magically transform this into what you see in other cultures or in other places into a Christian and godly kind of catechesis. And perhaps there was some intent there to curb the child abuse of previous generations? Maybe. But I think what ended up happening was kind of baptizing what we call liturgized spanking. And in many cases, that turned into abuse.
I do want to get your take, Kelsey, but I want to point out, I literally just turned to your page talking about calm spankings right before you said it. So we're all in sync now, and I need to order a couch later, and I'm going to let you know if it's the same as yours. We're all firing on all cylinders here.
We're on the same, yes.
Kelsey, what's your take on that?
I love it.
Not the couch on the topic.
Well, I can send you a link later for the couch.
Affiliate link coming through.
I do think there is something to this generational divide. I think older people, there is a generation of older readers who, when they read James Dobson, they were so probably abused as children that when they read Dobson, they read something that I wish my parents had read that. Even just hearing James Dobson say, you should be an involved father, you should not spank your children in anger. For some people, not for everyone, for some people that was like a radical paradigm shift. So I do think it is fair to say for some readers that felt radically different and very grace-filled, even though it was not. So I want to acknowledge that a little bit. And, I think we're seeing now that there's this, I think the people who probably were convinced by that held on to it really, really tightly, and
because it was a freedom for them at the time. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think I don't want to, I don't want to give a pass to that in any way, but John Fee, who's an evangelical writer, wrote a piece in The Atlantic kind of defending James Dobson not that long ago. I don't remember when that
a couple
came
years
out.
ago, I think. Yeah.
And he got some heat for that. But that's one thing he said. He said, I think my father was an okay father because he read James Dobson. And I recommend this book a lot. It's called Practicing What the Doctor Preached. It's by Susan Ridgely, and it's one of the very few academic studies of the impact of James Dobson's work that we have. It's an ethnographic study. It is scholarly, but her project is laying out the different ways that families practiced and implemented these things. And you get a really good sense of the ecumenical reach of this. Like, I think Catholic readers who were not steeped in like evangelical subculture had a different relationship with James Dobson than like fundamentalists who might have even not considered Dobson to be quite religious enough. Some of his books are actually not that religious.
He would have been outside our fold for a lot of stuff, where like he would have been a little too outside the Baptist realm to, you'd quote him, but you wouldn't say, you just say a well-known person says this, like that was
He's a psychologist.
He's a psychologist, right? And Dare to Discipline is not like a biblical parenting book really until like the last pages. There's some religious stuff back there, but it's a much more conservative book than it is Christian. But anyway, I really like that Susan Ridgely book because it helps explain what I would actually say is kind of my experience. As I grew up in a very evangelical, normie evangelical household where there were multiple Dobson books on the shelves. And I think some of it sounds so dismissive to say that there's an element of luck of the draw here, what kind of parents you had, what kind of family you were in. There are a bunch of mitigating circumstances, the temperaments and wisdom of my parents. I still have a great relationship with my parents. They're two of my closest friends. My dedication at the beginning of the book is to them. And I don't want to say it's entirely luck of the draw, but I do think there is so much variety in how people received and practiced these things. And that is why we can't give it a pass because all of that happened. All of it is real. And just because my experience did not involve abuse does not mean that someone could not pick that book up and absolutely get there. It's clear as day when I read it now.
Well, I definitely resonate with that. And the example I always give is like the preachers that I heard growing up. The first time I ever left that world and listened to Mark Driscoll, the first time I ever recommended Mark Driscoll to someone, I said, he's just so kind and compassionate. And it's like now I wouldn't say that, And so I think we do need to be careful not to justify someone just because by contrast they're not as abusive or their teaching is not as rough, just like, oh, my ex, hit me more than my current one does. They're better. It's like, yeah, this is all not good though. And there's still similar issues happening, but it is very much in some ways a Rorschach for the parent to go, what kind of parent are they? Because, my parents and, some of my friends' parents sat under the same sermons, read the same books. I had friends that got severe corporal punishment, from that same teaching. I received some, not near as much. And, again, I got the not as bad version of that with parents who tried to be really compassionate. I know we're butting up against the end of our time here. I have to ask this question though, because we referenced it. You talk about in the book, there's no way to gauge the harm of the parent who is spanking, hitting out of anger versus the very calm, collected parent, which whenever I read biographies of people talking about their experiences or I reflect on experiences, like, to me, the calm, collected seems so much scarier and creepy. In the surveys that you did with people and the interviews you did with people, did you talk about the dichotomy of those two things? And did you get any kind of, like, maybe you didn't have enough to like form a thesis in the book about it, but did you notice a difference of people who were spanked by like the calm, collected parent saying, we need to get this sin out of you versus the how dare you, obviously abusive parent, where it's like, yeah, that's like the stereotype that we expect. And either of you can answer that one. I don't have a specific direction for that one.
Well, in our questions, we did try and leave them very open-ended to kind of see how people would share about their experience. A few people did say they wished there would have been emotion, that they felt like that would have been easier to navigate than the calm detachment. I think when people were describing their experiences, what you saw is whatever the goal for even calm detachment was, it didn't necessarily happen. And in the same way that all these resources kind of present this idea that if you spank right early, you'll be done with spanking, that also didn't seem to happen. It was almost like, no, this became the primary tool. So sometimes maybe the parent, and so sometimes the parent would maybe be calm and kind of do the many layered thing of like, I'm going to go in the other room and pray and come back, and then I'm calm. And then sometimes they would just lose it. And sometimes it would be all day spanking session. And you get, I think, the ecumenical reach of these means, I think, for people who are all in, sometimes they're picking up this resource because things aren't working, right? They're drawn to the strong-willed child because they feel like they have a child that they can't control. So there's kind of a meeting of parents in a moment of overwhelm in a number of ways. So then they're picking up this resource that basically is going to tell them to escalate to get compliance. And maybe if that doesn't work, they're going to reach for another one. And they're going to come across Doug Wilson, who says you need reigns of terror and all-day spanking sessions, or Vodi Bokum, who says something similar. And I think it just reinforces it. Plus the theology that often comes in, that parents are told, look, you stand in God's stead. You're an agent of his authority. If you don't get your children to obey instantly now, they might not obey God down the road. No. And I think there's very little holding parents in check. Mm-hmm. Like maybe some are like, I'm being calm and doing this right. But if you've already crossed those lines, like it's a kind of nightmare scenario that can go in a number of different directions. And because there's a belief that God wants this, God endorses this, children need to be catechized into this, I think when you put all that in the package and you compare that to maybe a non-religious home where a parent, is angry and raging and maybe relying on corporal punishment, there's something that can be left behind in a different way in that home that there, I think, can't be when it's all mished up with the liturgies and this view of God. So I don't know. It's hard to say. Both are awful. Like, how do you say which is better? I do think some of the core messaging of like God sees you this way too, and the sin and this sort of thing, that those are core messaging that go beyond the physical punishment into the realm of emotional, psychological, spiritual mistreatment that has really long-lasting impact. Certainly when we heard the way people talked about their view of God as adults, being raised with that. So I don't know, it's kind of meandering answer. I don't know if there's a way to know, but both are just so tragic.
Everything Marissa just said. And I the one thing I will add is that the message always was there's more danger in being permissive than there is in being too harsh.
Yeah.
So I think that gave a lot of parents a little bit of permission even to worry about not being harsh enough.
Yeah.
Yep.
Especially with the eternal stakes you both mentioned in the book.
Yeah. Oh, and one other thing I wanted to mention is one thing we did notice is if you talk to parents and children, and children, adult children would note this for us. Often their parents would be like, you were only spanked a handful of times. Like, this is the parental response. And the adult child would have like visceral memories of, many more than a handful of times, and detailed things that the parent almost either couldn't admit to or couldn't retain. And so I think that maybe speaks to, like, we talk a lot about how do these practices understandably impact adult children, but they also trained parents too in certain ways to dissociate. If they were practicing calm spanking, they were kind of training themselves to shut down and do this, and to like ignore pain and kind of mechanically do this. So I think there's some of that in the conversation too, of like, oh, you're relying on memory and so many individual factors, and it trained whole families up into this way of relating.
Yeah. Well, I have like 10,000 more questions we could talk about, and there's so many layers to this, and so many things that I'd love to touch deeper on, and I'm sure we could have a future conversation. If this wasn't too painful, I would love to do that. I really appreciate the book. Really appreciate both of you giving such great, thoughtful answers. And thank you so much. For someone who is listening, there's a link to grab a copy. You can't see it, it's blurred out. There's a link to grab a copy of The Myth of Good Christian Parenting. Whether you want to listen to it, read it, whatever that looks like for you, be sure to grab a copy. And Marissa and Kelsey, thank you for all your research, for all your time and your expertise on this episode. Thank you.
Thank you
so much.